So really pleased to be here tonight. I have to lead with the disclosure that any opinions that I express are mine and mine only, not J.P. Morgan Chase's, so for the record. This topic, these guys are going to get tired. They're tired of hearing this, but there's a couple catalysts in my mind that were the genesis of wanting to learn more about this space and to organize the event tonight on this topic. First of all, my son was in high school 5 or 6 years ago, playing Madden. My wife comes to me and says, I've asked him 3 times. He's got homework. Can you go drop the hammer? Because something's got to be done. So I walk in the room and I'm like, Julian, come on. Your mom's asked you. You've got homework to do. And then I looked at the screen and I saw the quality of the images in Madden in the game, and it was almost like watching a real game. So I found myself sort of looking at the coverages and going, no, they're too deep here. You got to run the skinny post, and getting into the game. And at that point, I sort of realized that I understood the notion of sort of being a passive spectator of an eGame, right? Fast forward down the road 5 years later, I'm reading stories about Robert Kraft investing. Robert Kraft, for those of you who don't know, is the owner of the New England Patriots. Magic Johnson, Alex Rodriguez, people from the analog sports world, if you will, investing in the space. So with that as a backdrop, I'd like to thank Andrew Tosh, Jen McLean, and Alex Champlin for joining us tonight, and really look forward to their discussion. I think we're going to flow through sort of a historical backdrop on the growth of esports and a discussion of esports as a media vehicle, the impact of esports on game development, and also the investment environment, including trends in China where this phenomenon is substantially larger than what we're experiencing here in the US that could translate to future opportunities here, and a discussion of a recent capital raise by Jen and the experience of ReadyUp, what resonated with investors in that scenario. So with that, also like to cue up a video that sort of sets the tone in terms of the enthusiasm and the energy that's in this space. Hope you enjoy the evening. And
每个区域的队伍都更强，16支队伍，每一支队伍都蛮强的。
Your defending champions, SK Telecom T1. Goes right by it, but Huhi, level 1 roam! Right down, Bray gets hit. Yes, it is the roam. CLG coming together, showing up on the world stage. And they have the damage to get it done. Oh, he got it! Are you kidding me? Hey! Voice of light from Maple. They're going to be able to connect. Flash Wolves take down SK Telecom. Cloud9 have done it. One of the most amazing games I have ever seen.
Peanut's going for the 50-50. He stole it! It's secured! The Rocks Tigers get the Baron!
Is this gonna be the year when wildcard teams became a deal? I think yes. This time we are not just winning, we are looking better than our opponents.
This is gonna be it! San Francisco is going crazy! Brazil scored the biggest goal of the tournament so far!
The greatest triumph! All these minions are hitting the point like
Clifford, go! He's invulnerable!
He got it!
He's gonna get taken out! Oh my god!
They did it!
Oh my god, they did it!
ANX just took down the Rocks Tigers.
Oh no! That is a deleted! If ever I've seen one! And G2 are aced!
Yes, they failed. Yes, they could do better. But when they had nothing, they have shown their competitive spirit and they fought until the very end.
A little bit too low in this one. It is just a 1-for-1. The steal away. Yanko secures a absolutely massive outbreak. And EDG are evaporating. And it looks like H2K will seal the deal. Your first seed from Group C.
能有得到这个机会，对一个职业选手来说是很开心的一件事情。
This is our big shot. This is TSM's big shot.
Symbiosis still gets three-quarters. Man knockup. TSM are getting destroyed. Their hopes, their dreams, they're done. Royal and forced to Chicago.
팬들에게는 미안하지만 저희도 이기려고 여기 왔고.
Crown moves fast. He gets the signal. Petrifying gaze. Smoothie gets taken down. And it looks like Samsung Galaxy will be moving on.
유럽 HS팀 중에 저희밖에 안 남았는데 그래도 한 끝까지 살아남아서 유럽을 자랑스럽게 하고 싶어요.
Really good point about Olympic hero. He's just too tanky. The double now. Smurf parting it up with a frozen mouth and a bit of help from Miracle. Damage is almost enough without Forgiven Son to turn it around. Smear gets himself a triple. There's the Quadra. H2K demolished NX.
이제부터 시작이라고 생각하고 있어요.
He hops over the minions, sidesteps a deadly flourish. MLXG is looking for the kill. Sonic Wave connects, resonating strike. Duke might just survive. Mega Guns going up. The boomerang, the excitement, the hyper. Duke survives. SK Telecom advance to the semi-final at Worlds.
He is still chasing on the Deft, who's nearly out of HP. The chase in for Prey. First blood. That's two for Peanut. It might be a third.
It's going to be the rematch of Worlds last year. Rock's hoping to get revenge on SK Telecom T1, hoping to win a World Championship.
눈앞에 결승이 있다 보니까 결승까지 가고 싶어요.
No flash. Oh, never mind. We got more action.
Ryu's in so much trouble. Pounce is flashed away from, but Ambition gets one.
Diddley showing up for Cunningham, and now Ryu has the summoner.
Ryu's dead, no doubts about it. Number one, you gave Crown Victor.
And Ambition, he's got something to prove.
A 3-0 sweep of Europe's H2K will send Samsung Galaxy to the World Final.
크립토나잇 뭐 그런 정도까지는 솔직히 느끼지 않고요. 충분히 이길 수 있는 상대라고 항상 생각해왔고 지금도 그렇게 생각하고 있어요.
Rux doesn't actually have to stop pushing right now. They can delay the recall with Ash Arrow. Gonna get teleport.
He's gonna stop Duke.
They stopped
He
it.
stopped Duke. They're trying to bring it down. Is this not gonna be enough? Rux Tigers answer back with game 2.
There's the harpoon, there's the chase down, and Gorilla's going to make it rain. Into the bullet time, and it's going to be all the damage he needs. Gorilla getting the kill.
Rux Tigers 1 game away from breaking the curse.
How has Bengi been able to train as Nidalee? He's not known as a Nidalee player. They're confident first picking it in what could be an elimination game in Worlds.
They're going for Kuro. Double bomb on a Kuro. Javelin's going to land this time, and he's going to get the damage. Yes, he is. First blood in for Faker.
He's out.
The flash of Kuro, the stun of Faker, not going to matter.
Bengi.
And Bengi again.
SKT fight their way back in the elimination game. Bengi subs back, and he saves SKT. Now we're going to game 5.
Two Korean heavyweights in the fight of the Millennium.
제가 스맵 선수한테 1등 자리를 뺏겨서 아쉬움이 많이 컸고 이번 월드 챔피언십에서 다시 1등을 하자라는 생각을 많이 했고.
But they do see Faker, and the cocoon's not going to land though, so can they get anything else? The flash chase, it's Smeb onto his face, looking for a little bit more, and he's not going to go down. Faker, with just the ghost, gets away with it. It's all MG wrote for this one. SK Telecom T1 backs against the wall. Bengi himself, 3-0 against Rux Tigers in the series, and SKT punched their ticket to their 3rd World Final.
Hello, Staples Center!
We don't really know what to expect from this Samsung team. Yes, they crushed the bracket stage, but they haven't played a team as close to as good as SKT here. Might have some kill threat.
Lashes still gets got the last tick.
He's all
Crown solo kills Faker. Sidesteps away. Bengi's running in. Kill.
And that's the type of defeat you don't want to have if you're Samsung, because this is the momentum building of SKT's War Machine.
It looks like Samsung are coming back. They've killed Faker, found Bengi, and moving on to Duke.
And he's killed. The face tech that Ambition!
Ambition steals the Elder Dragon. Very good tidal wave. He's found 3. Charges up the Maelstrom, the slingshot. Faker's down. Samsung get 3. Play the Silver Scrapes. Samsung and SKT are going to game 5. Duke flashes forward, chomps down to kill Crown. SK Telecom have got 2, make that 3 kills. SK Telecom have overcome every challenge. They are the undisputed best team in the world. The SKT reign continues. They win their 3rd World Championship.
That was excerpts from the 2016 League of Legends Championships. So I wanted to, for those of you who haven't seen the enthusiasm and sort of the appeal, I wanted to set the tone with that. Alex?
All right.
All right.
That's fantastic. That's a really fantastic segue, I think, also into what so I'm Alex Champlin. I'm a grad student at UCSB. And so I'm going to kind of talk through the historical context for esports and kind of get us from 1997, 98, where sort of the model that we're looking at today kind of originates, up to the current moment. I can actually click through to my next slide. So, so I got into this kind of around 2010. So in 2010, I graduated from college, and it was kind of in the middle of this, this big economic recession, and so, so I had all these friends that were really fascinated with video games and with esports, and were kind of investing in these things as a potential career goal, and that was kind of when it clicked for me that this was like, a phenomenon that would, be my generation's thing. So that's where I come to this, but the history of spectator video games is a little bit longer than that. And so video games, as a technology, have kind of always been spectatable. The arcade cabinets from the 70s and 80s are designed so that multiple people can kind of look at them and see what's going on. And even through the 70s and 80s, you had this kind of this interest in turning video games into some other kind of media commodity. And so you had things like the Nintendo World Championship or a Space Invaders Championship. And the difference between this kind of media and the esports that we're talking about today really has to do with the focus on a spectator and kind of producing this this kind of fandom, the way you would find in a sport or something like that. And so Korea in the late 90s and early 2000s really kind of pioneers what we're talking about today. And so what I'm going to kind of talk through is a cultural or economic kind of context for this emergence, and then kind of talk about the platforms and the technologies that that gave rise to the kind of crystallized media commodity that we think of as esports, because I think it has a lot to say about the current moment as well. So 1997 saw this major sort of financial meltdown in Asia. South Korea was one of the countries that was particularly strongly hit by that, and so this kind of created this economic context where you had a lot of young men out of work, and so this is one of the sort of the cornerstones of esports emergence. Korea also had a much newer telecoms infrastructure, and so if you think of our telecoms infrastructure, we've kind of been updating that from the 50s. Korea had built theirs much more recently, and so they've kind of been ahead of us in terms of just the broadband capabilities that regular people enjoy. So the other kind of foothold that esports needed was technological. You had to be able to connect a bunch of players and a bunch of computers together to compete virtually. And so this is kind of the state of affairs in Korea as things are getting ready to heat up for esports. In 1998, in the US, Blizzard Entertainment, who continues to be a pretty big player in the in the esports thing, launches first StarCraft and then a patch for the game, Brood War. And this quickly sells over 1 million copies in Korea, and Korea's not a very large country, so that's like, I mean, that's a pretty astounding statistic. But Korea is also a very homogenous country from a cultural standpoint, and it's also a country where a lot of people's leisure activities take place in things outside of the home, and so coffee shops become places for people to get together. And at the time, Korea had this internet cafe infrastructure, and it was kind of designed so that people who didn't have home computers could rent a space or rent a computer and rent access to the internet. And so in the middle of a sort of a financial crisis, this became a space for young men, which is kind of the core demographic for esports in Korea, to gather and send out resumes and sort of figure their futures out, but also to play video games. And so, kind of overnight, StarCraft became this esports sensation in Korea, and people were playing it in these networked spaces with their friends, and it kind of grew to this point of being a national phenomenon. So a year later, this Korean cable TV network on Tunes, in a kind of like test of esports programming, broadcast this one competition between two high-ranked Korean video game competitors. And the thing was a smash hit. And so very quickly, this kind of turned from a one-off TV program into a cable channel kind of designed entirely to broadcast esports. And so this is another kind of crucial difference between the context that I'm going to kind of pivot to talk about in a second, and the Korean context was that Korea had this cable infrastructure that was, again, kind of aimed at a much more culturally homogenous market, and aimed at a real kind of like diverse set of interests. And so you had things like K-pop, and you had, I was there for research, and they have a TV channel dedicated to the board game Go, and billiards and things like that. So it's I mean, if you imagine our cable market and just the number of options kind of exploded and diversified. I mean, that's what we were looking at in Korea. And so, so this was kind of this perfect petri dish for esports to emerge as a real cultural fascination. And so, if you talk to people about esports today, the clip of League of Legends that we watched is a game where this is the case. Korea continues to produce some of the best esports athletes in the world, and it's largely due to this legacy. And it's this phenomenon that that's aged pretty well in Korea. So if you imagine a lot of young people in their 20s at the turn of the century, by 2018, we're looking at people who now have kids and who have kind of grown up on esports and have grown into adults who are fans of esports, and it's now this kind of this cultural thing that continues to produce these top athletes. And so, in thinking about how this kind of helps us understand the current moment, I've tried to signal here these three things that I think make for the kind of petri dish that you need for something like esports to emerge and for it to kind of succeed at a level that takes it beyond the space of LAN competitions or really sort of small-scale niche media. So the first is infrastructure. And in the case of South Korea, you had the sort of the proliferation of broadband, deeper internet penetration, and PC bongs specifically. And so this meant that people had access to the game without necessarily having to purchase their own copy. They could kind of go to the space and play a pickup game of StarCraft or something like that. Socially or culturally, the kind of concentration that you have in a small country like Korea is different than trying to make esports happen for something as big as the U.S. or in a global scene. The cable market and the large player base located in a single country also kind of helped crystallize that. And so this is what I'm going to be talking about going forward, is the kind of the need to get to a tipping point or a saturation point to make esports kind of run. And then the economic market. So players at this time were looking at high unemployment, and we're also kind of representing a very narrow demographic. So, what I've talked about is kind of like the late 90s to early 2000s, and then I'm going to jump basically a decade and kind of talk about the emergence of a global esports scene. The US was slow to catch up, and so I said, esports existed as LAN tournaments and as competitions, but they didn't have the reach of Korean esports. And so what it took for esports to kind of become the thing that we're here to talk about today was this shift in platform and really the creation of and clustering of a market for esports consumers. And so I'm gonna talk about a couple of things. I'm gonna talk about a series of games that came out in the 2010, 2012. I'm gonna talk about a series of platforms that kind of pushed, internet websites, platforms that pushed esports into the mainstream. And I'm also gonna kind of talk about the social and cultural context for this sort of current round of esports. So in 2010, Blizzard Entertainment released the follow-up to StarCraft. They released StarCraft 2. And this was kind of before global esports were the thing that we're talking about today, but they were kind of, there was this hope around StarCraft 2 as this text that would bring esports into the mainstream in the West. And so StarCraft 2 launched, and if you wanted to watch it, it had a fairly clunky interface. So you had to either download this platform that lets you stream games as they were played in Korea. You could watch as people were playing in Korea. But it was very clunky, and you had to kind of be a fan of StarCraft already to know about that. And otherwise, things circulated on platforms like Twitch, on platforms like YouTube, and sort of a video on demand after the fact format. In 2011, though, this live streaming platform, Twitch, started to broadcast games content, and so that's really the kind of the catalyst for a lot of what we're talking about. You had this platform where anybody could sit down and play a video game for an audience and theoretically make a career or at least sort of make a side income doing this thing. And so you had all of these young people really fascinated with Twitch as a possibility, as a sort of a space for for producing fans or producing a name for themselves. And this is kind of where I want to come back to my fascination with this phenomenon. So in 2010, I just graduated from college, and I was making the transition into grad school. And I had a bunch of friends who were doing the same thing, but we were also, we were kind of trying to figure out ways to make our fascination with games, more than just a kind of an activity that we did, amongst ourselves. And so, so these platforms started to provide a way to see this sort of game fandom, game culture that we'd all been a part of in a new light. It produced these celebrities or these figures around around the games that we liked. And it also produced a space where we could kind of come together and, and watch the games that we were interested in. And so I was, at the time, fascinated with StarCraft and the game League of Legends. And if you wanted to watch either of these competitively, you had to tune into Twitch. Twitch kind of became this hub where fans of a whole range of different games could come together and watch esports content relative to whatever their interest was. And so what this produced was the kind of petri dish that you had in Korea, although now it's dispersed over the internet and all of these different esports texts potentially. But what it meant was that if I was a fan of StarCraft 2, I would be on Twitch and I might see something happening with CSGO, or I might see something happening with a Call of Duty game, or with something in the Halo series. And so all of a sudden you had this market that had existed in the US and existed in Europe kind of broadly, finding a hub, finding a place to kind of connect and congeal around esports. And so it was a kind of a combination of people's familiarization with streaming platforms and a kind of a comfortable, kind of a switch in your media diet towards consuming things offline. So this is, these are cord cutters. This is kind of a post-cable market, and this is kind of how esports finds its foothold in a global sense. It also coincided with the sort of the ubiquity of phones. That people's cell phones kind of became portals to watch Twitch. It's also kind of driven by a games market that was much more complete, or much more. Sorry. That was more robust, and also kind of growing in a way that that was challenging other media, other sort of established media. And so what you had here was this space where esports could really kind of begin to grow out and develop into the kinds of franchises that we see with like the League of Legends promo or the Overwatch League. And so where StarCraft and the sort of the Korean esports phenomenon emerged out of this fascination with a particular game, the sort of the emergence of esports in the West depended on Twitch as a platform to sort of organize this content, but also depended on the sort of the health and maturity of the games market. And so what actually happened was the developer for the game League of Legends and a number of other games kind of followed suit, but what they did was kind of take a managing interest in esports and sort of turning esports from something that was largely community-driven and kind of a fan practice that existed in hotel conference rooms and things like that, and turned it into this this media commodity that used Twitch as a kind of a platform to share and connect with its audiences. And so the reason this worked for League of Legends and for a number of esports that kind of followed suit was that these games were driven by microtransaction economies. And so this is kind of the point that I want to pivot to in the last, that's big. In the last part of this presentation. So esports are not TV sports. And the point I want to make is that the sort of the Korean dependence on cable as a way to sort of to circulate and reach its audience isn't necessarily the way that that esports circulate in the kind of contemporary scene. So esports are a kind of post-TV media. They function really through an ability to tap platforms and kind of tap a user that's kind of consuming games and interested in media that's kind of post television. Let's see. So I want to point out two statistics, and I'm going to kind of move into a discussion of them. This is Newzoo does a lot of kind of data research for games markets, but they're producing a lot of stuff about esports and the sort of the emerging market around esports advertising, esports as a kind of as a consumer product. So this is their graph, but what I really want to kind of draw your attention to is this this $906 million of revenue for esports projected for this year. That's an astounding figure for a new phenomenon, but this is the revenue for League of Legends, which is a free-to-play video game, which sounds kind of crazy, right? That this free-to-play video game is also, I should say, this is almost a 10-year-old video game. So this is the game that got me interested in this esports thing. So League of Legends survives on this free-to-play model, where players buy skins, buy characters, buy items in this game, rather than ever buying the game as a core commodity. And so I think this is where, if we want to kind of differentiate esports from traditional sports, or think about what kind of makes this thing unique, I think this is the kind of the statistic that we have to pay attention to. Oh, that's rough. Can we actually, if we exit full screen, does it not block that? At any rate, what this says is it's part of a platform economy. And Twitch is a platform for esports, but what you have to kind of think about when you're considering the broader field here is that each of these games actually is a platform in their own right. So when we're talking about esports as a kind of a broad phenomenon, that's one thing. But each game as an esports text is kind of its own entity. And so some games will be really successful and have these long 10-year lifespans as these competitive scenes. And other games might be designed as esports and not actually achieve something like that. And so when you think about these things, you really have to kind of understand them in terms of platforms and user bases, and think about, okay, well, what are they getting users to do? They've succeeded up until this point really as an industry that runs in parallel to the booming games industry. And so something like League of Legends, while a really impressive esports, it's also a really impressive video game, and that it's lasted for 10 years in a market where an iteration of a game kind of lasts for a year or two before the sequel comes out. And so what they've kind of perfected is this product cycle, and esports is situated in their model of marketing or producing League of Legends. The recently launched Overwatch League has a sort of a similar structure. So these are major esports productions, but they serve as a kind of sort of synergistic or kind of complementary, almost like a leader to their games markets. And so in drawing this distinction between esports and traditional sports, what I want to signal is that you really have to understand esports as a product of, or a component of, a broader sort of games market. And the largest esports games have a number of kind of crucial things in common. They're multiplayer, they have a competitive element. Most of them kind of condense competition into these 15 to 30 minute segments. And some of the most successful ones are free to play. So they don't charge users for subscriptions or for the base cost of a game, but instead they drive these sort of secondary markets around game content, essentially. But this means that there is a lot of potential room for growth in esports. It means it's a fairly volatile industry. You have a very sort of high turnover of games and franchises, and so StarCraft 2, which kind of started this esports wave, has really kind of slid down the esports charts as things like League of Legends, and then Overwatch and Counter-Strike. Kind of Call of Duty has been this like perennial esports presence, but there's a lot of turnover, and so esports as a thing seems to be this, this really fascinating and rapidly expanding media industry. But game to game, you see all of these different kind of patterns of growth and different practices of production. So there's a great deal of turnover, but it becomes predictable in the sense that players follow trends. What you're looking for with esports is that petri dish. You want a user base that's robust and growing, and so to the extent that esports are sustaining the games that they're featuring, that's usually a good sign that that the game is healthy and that the esport is healthy. Is the growth and loyalty of a player base. I always want to say something about demographics when I'm doing these presentations. Twitch notes that its user base is roughly 80% male, and it says that like 50% of them are between the ages of 18 and 35, and you can kind of suspect that the other 50% skews towards the lower end of that spectrum. So that means that there's a lot of room to attract women, to attract these young fans that will kind of grow and mature into dedicated esports players or fans. Esports games generally have high player bases, and you really want to kind of like well, I'll leave it to Jennifer, who's going to talk about China. But in Korea and in China, the PC cafes have these sort of lists of what players are choosing to play, and Twitch has this algorithm that sorts the games that it features, and so these are usually pretty good marks of what people are playing, what the hot esports titles are, and I think that's one way of kind of seeing the growth of this phenomenon. And really, I've said this already, but these up to this point, esports have been designed to complement game economies, and so thinking of them as their own standalone media industry, I think kind of misses the broader picture that these large scale, very successful esports promotions like the League of Legends World Championship or the Overwatch League in LA, or the Dota International, which always sort of seems to set the record for the largest esports prize pool, are run by the license holders or the publishers behind these games. And so there's this sort of deeply synergistic character that really can't be extracted from the sort of the broader games market. But it's also very young. At less than 20 years old, it's this this fascinating media commodity that's really kind of deeply experimental, but experimenting with all these these new ways of connecting to fans, of sort of existing outside of the traditional television infrastructure, of leveraging platforms and and oscillating between platforms and between sort of media modes. So I think there's a lot of really exciting room for growth, and I don't know, be a pretty neat 10 years after this. All right, that's my presentation.
All right. I did this presentation for my 9-year-old son before tonight, and I asked him what he thought, and he said, it's a little long. So I'll try to tighten it up for you on the fly here. Okay, so my name's Andrew Tosh. I've worked as a software engineer in the video game industry for like over 15 years. And about 10 years ago, I started a company called GameSim, based out of Orlando, Florida, which is where I was living. And we provided engineering outsource services for the video game industry. So we get hired by the large publishers to help them with whatever they're doing. Sometimes small titles we'll do entirely, but usually helping with mostly console games. We actually were acquired last year, about a year ago, by a large company called Keyword Studios. And they do outsource video game development, all kinds of different things, art, engineering, localization, audio, you name it. And so they acquired us, but we still a separate studio. I moved out here to Santa Barbara about 3+ years ago. But what I want to talk today about is regarding esports and how esports is affecting development, because that's the sort of area that I know in terms of what is the impact that it's having on publishers' decision-making in terms of design, especially. So first of all, video game competitions are not a new thing. You had in the early, mid-90s, a company called ID Software made some games that I'm sure everyone's heard of, Doom, Quake, Wolfenstein 3D. These are really important games. A lot of people think of them as being revolutionary in terms of being the first-person shooter, which they certainly are. But they also supported LAN. So LAN is local area network, so just a network that's, think of this, not on the internet, but your computers can talk to each other that are on the same network. So back in the day with this, you would have Doom on your machine, and you pick up your computer and you bring it to your friend's house, and you set up your own little LAN, and you can play Doom against each other on your own computer. This was very new, right? Before this, the only multiplayer games were, you were on the same computer, or you're on the same console, or on the same arcade machine. So this was a new thing. And this is actually one of the early Quake competitions, you can see, and that Quake competition actually is still going on today. They've kept that going for a long time. So esports is emerging out of this. You have in the late 90s with the internet boom, it just gradually becomes just a given that every game is going to have online multiplayer support. Actually, a story for like about 5 years ago, a company called BioWare, which is owned by EA, is a studio that contacted us, my company, about wanting some online engineers to help them with Mass Effect 3. This was very confusing to me because Mass Effect, if you know this series at all, was 1 and 2 were totally story-driven games. There was no online aspect at all. It was a campaign mode style game. But they contacted us about wanting online, so I was like, all right. So we added online. Mass Effect 3 was the first that actually had multiplayer support. They got a lot of pushback from the hardcore fan base about not wanting multiplayer, that it was a story, but it worked from our perspective, and we got paid, so we were happy. But it just happens that now it's just moving that all games are adding some level of multiplayer support. You have on top of this streaming exploding, right? So we just heard from Alex talking about how much Twitch is going crazy, and Sony's got their own platform and so on, where it becomes fun to be a spectator, to watch maybe your friends play a game at a competition, or maybe to watch somebody that's incredibly good at a game that you love, right? Where it's you become a fan of certain players. Then you also have to look at this in the context of the video game industry a little bit. So there's even really before esports was emerging, there was this concentration of video games that was happening. So the major publishers are becoming less interested in developing small experimental games. And they're much more interested in focusing on their big IP that makes a lot of money and putting more resources into those to make those games much richer environments, larger worlds, more game modes, more features. So we have that concept. And then esports is really reinforcing that and making that even more extreme because you're making certain games really hit the stratosphere as far as popularity goes, where you're seeing people, I mean, celebrities as far as being so good at particular sports. So we're seeing a lot of concentration in terms of particular IP making a lot of money, and indie developers struggling a lot more because it's much more difficult to break through, and the big publishers are not making very many experimental type games. They're really focusing on their IP that makes money. Also the context, I'm sure everyone has heard of software as a service. Well, the game industry is doing the same thing, where it's going to be moving into games as a service. So Alex was talking about League of Legends being 10 years old. That's true, but it's just going to be continuously updated, where there isn't necessarily a release and then buy the next one. If you're an NBA fan, maybe you buy NBA 2K every year, right? And so every year it comes out and you throw down $80 for the new version. That eventually will probably go away, and it'll be more that you're paying $5 a month to 2K, and you have access to NBA 2K, and they're just constantly keeping that thing up to date for you on a regular basis. And there isn't a release of a new game anymore. So with that as the context, you have this publishers needing to take into account this new concept of spectators, right? So all this backstory is related to putting all your resources into making an experience for a player, right? That's your ultimate goal. It's like, how do I make this fun for the player? But now there's this new thing of, wait, how do I make it fun for somebody watching, right? And that's really kind of a newer concept that the game designers are dealing with. How do we make something where the customer is not the player, the customer is a spectator? And then the business on top of that is even more complicated, is how do I make money on those eyeballs, right? Because why do I care about supporting that viewer if I don't make money ultimately on it? So we'll talk to those things a little bit now. So has anyone, raise your hand if you played Madden NFL any time recently. Okay, got a handful. Okay, so you'll watch this and you won't be intimidated. But I'm expecting that if you don't play Madden NFL, this might be sort of an intimidating experience. So this is how you play Madden. This is the play call screen. This is somebody that knows what they're doing, that's going through the available options, selected a play that they thought made sense for the mode. So you have to know football and you have to understand the game itself. Then when he went to the line of scrimmage, I should have paused it or something. You notice he probably hits a hotkey which showed the routes the wide receivers were going to run to and the key that you would have to hit to throw it to that particular person. You can do even, you can do even more advanced things like call audibles at the line of scrimmage, and you can get as advanced as football is. So EA Sports motto for a long time was, if it's in the game, it's in the game, right? So that's their focus, is that hardcore export user that is really interested in learning all the how to play this game. That's not necessarily how people watch football, right? This is how you watch an NFL game if you're just a fan of football. So you notice we're zooming in on a lot of individual players trying to get personalities. Do we then get a side view, right? Which is different from what Madden showed. Madden was behind you.
On third down now, the pass incomplete.
and they were behind you for a particular reason, is that would be the only way you could see all the routes, right, as they run down the field. When you're watching an NFL game, you'll notice that when the wide receiver gets about, I don't know, 10 yards, 15 yards down, you can't see where they're going anymore, right, unless it gets thrown to them, and then you can see where they happen to be. Because you don't care, okay, unless you're Rick. Rick seems like he knows something about football. But if you're a viewer like me, I don't really know what a slot, I'm just watching to see if you got a touchdown or not, right, kind of thing. And that's what the NFL has found is the best user experience. You might notice that they do have that camera that's like on a cord sometimes at the light, but it's not very popular, right? So they usually go away from it and go back to the side view that people find more comfortable. So EA was aware of this. And they decided that they added a new feature into Madden called the spectator mode. And they actually hired cinematographers that worked at the NFL to help them replicate how does an NFL production work. So this is a game where we are watching two other people play. We are a spectator in this game. So this is a mode that you can go into the game where you can say, I want to watch this game that's in progress and being played. And you'll notice we're having a camera angle that's much more similar to what an actual NFL game is. We're doing a lot of zoom in and cut scenes, and it's trying to present itself much more like you would get from a presentation as if you were watching an NFL game. And this is going after Rick, right? So this is going after him where he can watch this game, getting rid of all the user interface stuff that's confusing as far as the play calling screen. In addition, so I kind of mentioned before LAN support, local area network support. So that was kind of the dawn of online, or not online, of multiplayer gaming there. And it sort of went out of fashion, right? Because when we had online player modes, everything was in essential servers that was managed by the game. So EA's server, you just have to be connected to the internet in order to play multiplayer. So tournaments hate that. Right? So if you're in a big tournament, you don't want to rely on having a strong internet connection or have to deal with the EA server going down for maintenance in the middle of your tournament for some reason. So you want to be on your own local area network. Also, it's going to be much lower latency, so like you don't have to worry about any sort of complaining about I didn't win because there was some sort of internet problem. So actually, Alex was talking about StarCraft 2. When it came out originally, it did not have LAN support. It was all just pure online. And the community had a huge backlash about wanting LAN support back in the game, like it had in StarCraft. And they eventually, Blizzard had to give in and actually added support back for that. It was really sensitive. There we go. So this is my last slide here. Do most game publishers care about esports? Man, it's a very difficult question. So the initial, I think, reaction from the typical IP owners and publishers was, it's good, right? You want to support it, right? It's going to ultimately drive people to buy more of the games because it's going to make our game more popular. I don't know if that's really borne out by data and it is actually true. You know, I watch the NFL. Does it necessarily make me want to go play football? Maybe not. So there is I think, an interest now in the publishers of figuring out how to monetize directly, right? So how do we actually make money on that? So you're seeing Tencent and EA and Activision Blizzard starting to invest in their own tournaments. Is that a good idea? I don't know. It's very outside the ballpark of what they do as a business, so we'll see. You probably heard about that shooting at the Madden competition in Jacksonville. So EA is doing these Madden competitions to get out there. And if you watch, they have the broadcast online, they look exactly as if you're watching NFL today, right? They have like they have actual NFL players, they have actual eSports gamers in there, and they're kind of talking strategy and presenting it very similar to what you would see on a given Sunday morning. So it's a very open-ended question that I don't have an answer to. They are definitely interested in it, but they're trying to figure out how to monetize it more directly because it is, like I was showing before, going to cause a significant investment on their side in order to support it properly. So you saw EA adding that spectator mode. Like if we saw some of the League of Legends videos previously, raise your hand if you play League of Legends. Okay, so for everybody else, that made no sense to you, right? Like of what was going on in that screen. So how do we take some of those games that are maybe very complicated and make them still fun for the non-players to enjoy watching, and how do we make money on it is the question that the publishers are dealing with.
Some of this was already talked about, but just for a big overview of why esports is so important, it's the first global audience of literally anything in the world. I mean, soccer's a pretty global audience. Esports is a truly global audience. A title like League of Legends reaches everyone in the world. So you might, for soccer, maybe you've got, you know, MLS fans here, you know, different leagues fans in Europe. You know, everybody's watching these esports tournaments. Streaming is, as we've heard, is really driving the market, and everybody's really trying to get into esports. So for game publishers, we were talking about League of Legends has been around for 10 years. I mean, that's a dream come true for a game publisher. You know, it used to be you'd buy your game at the store for $60, you'd play it for about 40 hours, you'd be done. Maybe if it was a sandbox style or a sports game, you'd get a little more time out of it. You know, now this game has been around for 10 years and they're making a fortune. So you can imagine everybody's scrambling to put, you know, esports components into their games. They're also all the publishers are trying to form their own leagues. I believe the buy-in for an Overwatch franchise is now about $2 million, is that right? I mean, it's just incredible. And traditional sports franchises are trying to get into it too. They know that their audiences are getting older. They know that people are not watching broadcast TV as much anymore. So it's a way for them to reach a younger audience. The NBA especially is the most active in esports. Most of the NBA teams have got some kind of an investment in esports. They might own a team or they've heavily invested into a franchise. So it's probably good to watch what the NBA teams are doing. And then all the media and technology companies, they're just investing in everything from teams to leagues to streaming tools. You know, Amazon's big acquisition of Twitch a few years ago. And then another interesting thing to pay attention to with Twitch is, I don't know if you saw the broadcast of the NFL game, where they kind of had all of these different widgets layered on so you could track stats. They were trying to let you watch an NFL game the way that you would maybe watch an esports game, where you can kind of get all this deeper information. So that's something to, you can probably see a stream of the way that they showed that if you weren't aware that that happened. And then brands, there's a $1 billion advertising market predicted. Our platform is currently in beta, and we actually already have several major brands who are getting involved with us that'll be launch partners, because everybody's looking for a way to reach this valuable audience. So game development, I'll talk about it a little more from a business side, because I'm obviously not a game developer. The most important thing I think to know about these esports titles is they're really driven by the community. So League of Legends didn't set out and say, we're going to make an esports title. You know, they developed a great game. People started playing it with teams, started independently organizing and playing it competitively, and it kind of grew organically. You know, PUBG, the same thing. The community really adopted. CSGO, the community adopts it. So the community's got to adopt it and like it enough to want to organize and form teams. They need to like it enough to build their skill level and play exclusively, you know, hours a day on this one game instead of trying a lot of different games. So it's really community driven, and you'll actually see with a lot of the tournaments, some of the purses are driven by the community too, where the fans are contributing to the prize purses that the teams and the competitors are getting, which is pretty different. again, adding multiplayer modes, adding MOBA onto games that were previously single player, games as a service, and you'll also hear the term live operations. So instead of just shipping something, maybe sending out a few bug fixes, you've got your servers and your maintenance and your customer service and everything running, 24/7, because these are like living, platforms that people are always on. And PC and peripherals, it's been huge for the PC. My first job in the game industry was I was working for the Game Developers Conference. And at the time, everybody thought that PC gaming was going away, the consoles were going to take over everything. And now people are wondering if this is the last generation of game consoles that's going to be released, which is a huge reversal, and it's really due to esports. And then you can imagine it's also incredibly valuable to people who are making keyboards, gaming chairs, all kinds of gaming peripherals. We were over with clients at NVIDIA, and they were showing us all of these, their gaming system, and then they've got all of these new tools so that you could look at your game in 360 and kind of analyze later from every angle how you played it, or share it with your friends like that, or being able to capture a, capture a better video or capture a better image of your gameplay. And then mobile esports is actually, in Asia, there are now more people playing mobile esports than are playing PC esports. And actually about 50%, the biggest title is one called Honor of Kings. It's called Arena of Valor here. And about half of the players in Asia are women. So that's a big difference. So now I want to get into a little bit about China. I have some data from an analyst company called Nico Partners. They analyze data and the gaming industry in China, and then also in Southeast Asia, which is the fastest growing games industry. Thailand is right now #1. Vietnam is really up and coming, especially in mobile. But you look at all of these huge numbers, and you can get these from a site called esc.watch. You see all these huge numbers. 95% of these people are in China. So that's just astounding when you think about that. So China, so in the U.S. we're paying a lot of attention to the industry in China, and it's for a lot of different reasons. Part of the reason that it's so big in China was consoles were banned in China for a long time. You just couldn't buy them. You could buy gray market consoles, but in a country where the average household income wasn't that high, it was really a luxury product. So, and people didn't have great PC gaming systems at home. They would go play in iCafes. So, you can imagine that this is a great way for an esports culture to get started. Also, most of these games are free to play, and then, you're spending in the game as you go along. People in China will also happily pay for coaching or training to get better at the game. They're obsessed with moving up the levels. They'll actually sacrifice graphic quality for better gameplay and to move up faster. They're very focused on competition there. So the other thing about China is, since esports has been so established, it's as mainstream there as traditional sports. So the top esports competitors in China are as well known as NBA or NFL athletes here. And the shoutcasters, which are the people who narrate these tournaments, either live or when they're streaming them, are also as well known as a lot of the sportscasters here. They're celebrities. These shoutcasters make huge amounts of money. The video streaming platforms in China are all competing with each other to, #1, sign top streamers, and #2, sign top shoutcasters with exclusive contracts. So that's something we'll probably see here. All of these things are things that we'll see in the US. The trends are just happening a lot faster and on a much bigger scale in Asia. So the top competitors are earning huge amounts of money. The streaming is at a gigantic scale. Tencent just made some pretty big investments in two different streaming platforms in China. One's Douyu and one is Huya. And they're planning IPOs. Tencent is another company, if you're not paying attention to, you probably should be. They actually own a lot of game companies or parts of game companies in the US. So for example, Riot Games, Tencent owns them. They let Riot, they're very like quiet with their brand. They let Riot, you know, pretty much run their own company, but they're there. So if you look them up, you'd actually be surprised at how much of the US games market they own or they control. Tournament prize pools are continuing to grow. The interesting thing is 20% of that prize pool in Asia is now on mobile. And the franchising of leagues, so I mentioned that, you know, Overwatch, these franchises are very expensive. They've been doing that for a long time in China, so there's been players that have been able to kind of have a steady, you know, steady living, and not just kind of the top players. There's kind of a middle class of professional players that can make a living and, you know, play all the time. They have a lot of government support. Esports is going to be a medal event in the next Asian Games. They did a test in the 2018 Games, and it was really successful. There's talk about it being part of the Olympics. The IOC is actually pretty concerned about, you know, game violence. They're going to need a little more choice than just the, what's the game where you play soccer with trucks? What's that? Yeah, Rocket League. They're going to need more choice than like just Rocket League to have that be viable. So I actually think that that's a farther away. And then education. Tencent had a tournament this year and 278 college teams signed up. So, you know, there's starting to be college teams here. UC Irvine now has a program you can major actually in esports too. It's part of the curriculum. But, you know, 278 is just unbelievable. And then the other thing about China, which is why I wanted to, and all of Asia, which is why I wanted to show you the video of Garena, is that fan culture is really different than it is here. I don't know how many of you have been to like E3 or PAX or any of those game conferences. So, you know, there's a lot of fans there. They're pretty excited about things. If you go to Garena World in Thailand, it's a whole different story. Or I've been able to go to China Joy quite a few times, and I think 175,000 people or something went this year. And it's gigantic, and there's these big screens, but the people aren't just like playing esports. So I was telling these guys, they'll have a rapper, or they'll have a band playing on stage, or they'll have like, you know, people dancing, and the shoutcasters are yelling the whole time. And, you know, there was one trailer that they were showing and everybody was crying. Like, just the intensity of these fans is just, and the passion is like nothing you've seen in the US. And I think that we'll get there in the US. So now going to investment in the US. So you'll see that it's following China a bit with the different trends that people are investing in. And you can see this is a chart from TechCrunch's Crunchbase. And investment in esports in the US and startups, it's up 1,000% or something over the last 2 years. It's just incredible, the money that's coming into it. And so streaming, I mentioned Tencent investing into Huya and Douyu. The Korean esports network that you mentioned, ONG, just invested $100 million into PUBG. And I believe they have the streaming rights, and they're also going to help start up a PUBG professional esports league. Mobile esports is another area that the publishers and investment is coming into. PUBG has started up a mobile tournament in the US. If you were at E3, you would have seen that Arena of Valor had a big stage set up, and they had a tournament going through the whole time, and a lot of people watching it. And Clash Royale is the publisher of Clash Royale. Supercell is also heavily investing in their mobile tournaments. So esports stadiums and facilities, there are so many dedicated stadiums and facilities in Asia. And part of it started out with the iCafe culture. And, you know, if you went into these years ago, they would just be a bunch of chairs, a bunch of screens. They weren't that nice inside. You go into the higher end ones now, and they're really optimized for esports. Some of them even have stages in there. They might have bars. They've all got like great chairs and the top of the line equipment, and they're set up so that you could go and watch people in an esports match as well as play yourself. You're starting to see some dedicated stadiums in the US. I think there's one, but there's still, there's one that's a standalone now, but most of them are part of other stadiums where they might have a separate room for, you know, esports for a smaller tournament, or they might kind of convert the big floor into an esports tournament. But there is investment in standalone facilities in the US. Leagues and teams, Cloud9, I think, just took in $50 million. There was another one that I think just announced this week that took in $15 million. And when you're talking about these teams, it's not just a single team that's getting invested in. So somebody like a Cloud9 or a Dignitas has multiple teams at different levels with different games. So they're not just, it's not just like a League of Legends franchise. They'll have a League of Legends team. They'll have a CSGO team. You know, they'll have a team for all of the big titles that they're supporting. And the other thing that is really sponsorable by brands are the houses where these esports athletes are going and training. So they'll put all these players in a house together with their coach so that they can train, you know, all day. And so you could imagine that a, you know, PC manufacturer wants to get their computers in there. You know, a chair manufacturer will donate all the chairs. I mean, all of these sponsors are, you know, they're sponsoring their sleeves, they're sponsoring their jerseys. And then the other interesting thing about these houses is a lot of sports nutrition companies are getting into sponsoring this. So there's a huge, there might be the stereotype of these, you know, of these like skinny, pale gamers that all they do is play games, but actually the top gamers are really, they're really physically fit. They're working out, they're very focused on their nutrition. I mean, they have to be, they have to really like take care of themselves physically to play at the level that they're playing at. And in fact, the co-founder of ReadyUp, who is a former competitor, was also a varsity athlete in high school. And he ran 5 miles a day, you know, while he was training for esports, and, you know, doesn't drink caffeine when he's competing, and, you know, and things like that. So their physical condition is very much on their mind, which is then on the mind of sponsors. And then college and high school teams, leagues, curriculum. NACE is a big organization at the college level. There's another startup called PlayVersus, and they're organizing leagues for high schools. And they just took in $15 million. So, you know, at every level, you're seeing the infrastructure grow to, you know, kind of the infrastructure that you'll see with traditional sports. So infrastructure and tools are where my startup plays. So we, our group that founded this, one of the founders is Jonathan Wendell, or Fatality, who was the first competitive esports player, and he's actually going to be inducted into the esports Hall of Fame in a couple months. So that's pretty awesome. And then we also know Fatality. A few of us were at IGN, and we had worked on a competitive gaming league years ago that he was involved with. And his vision was always to create a platform where anyone who wanted to compete, you know, could get into the industry. So the parts of ReadyUp are meet, compete, and get better. And meet is finding or forming teams. Teams can recruit and find players. Players can find teams. People can find each other and organize. Compatibility. will, as people tell us more about themselves, we'll be able to match people that they have things in common with. So, you know, as a player, you're about more than your skill level and the game that you play. You might have a certain play style that you like. You might like to get in there and really like trash talk everybody, or you might not like that. So if you find people that kind of have your similar gaming like values, you will be able to, you know, you'll be able to kind of form a team and stay with them a lot longer. And then Compete, this was actually the product that we started with. It's just a suite of team management tools, scheduling calendars. This was what the first kind of thing in the industry that we thought we could fill. And as we started talking to all of the different advisors and players that we were working with, they said actually one of the hardest things that you know, that we have to do is, you know, trying to find other people to play with and stay together. And guys were telling us that they were like bouncing around to, you know, a lot of different teams. So we added the meet component. Then the Get Better was another thing that came from what gamers were telling us is, you know, they wanted a way to find someone to give them coaching services, or if they were really expert, they wanted to be able to, you know, offer coaching services or sell skins, or, you know, we've got guys who do things like design logos for teams, and they, you know, they design websites for teams and do things like that. So the marketplace will match, you know, all of those people together. And of course, our sponsors already are having ideas like, what if we get this NBA player together with this pro gamer, and then we, you know, sponsor that, and then we offer that for, you know, people to play. So that's what that's about. And interestingly, when we were, so we just completed a seed round of about $2 million, and then we're fundraising a little bit more, and then we'll be doing a Series A at the in Q1 of next year. The platform's in beta right now, so we've got players in there, and we're just kind of gradually growing it as we're, you know, testing out all the features and making sure that they're working. When we were first talking to investors, they actually were more excited about the Meet than about the Compete, because they saw that that was a lot more potential for scale, because there's a lot more people who just want to find other players than are maybe going to organize a team or use a, you know, use a marketplace. So that was the thing that, you know, that investors saw was kind of the biggest runway into the mass market. The other thing that they liked was, you know, if you've got a platform, and, you know, I've sort of had this at other media companies too. I was at IGN for a long time, and, you know, if the industry rises, like your platform rises. You're not sort of dependent on a single title or a single team for how you're doing. So that was another thing that, you know, investors were telling us that they liked. And then they also liked the network effect of, if you're managing a team, you know, we get that user, but then you also get, you know, however other many people are on the roster for that game. So, you know, you might have 10 people on your roster. Some of these teams have got more than 50 people on their roster, because they're constantly cycling people in and out depending on, you know, their availability or who they need for a tournament. And then the other thing that, you know, that I've sort of seen with a lot of the startups is a lot of the investors are looking more at the team. They sort of feel like if you've got the right team in place, they're investing in the team, and they trust that you're going to, you know, build what you say you're going to build. So the team was almost more important to some investors than the product. And then actually the other investors were something that's been really helping us get more investors. So there's kind of a network effect with investors. If they see that you've got people who are going to be valuable to growing your business. So, you know, we've got strategics in, you know, gaming, finance, blockchain, traditional sports. You know, they like to see that, because those people are going to add value. And then they also, you know, the investors all network and they add value to each other. So one of our investors that just came on board because he said we had a murderer's row of, you know, people in gaming. So that was something that, that was something that was totally totally unexpected. But, so these are some of the reasons that we're seeing, any company get funded. But
I want to pose one question to the panel, and then we'll open it up to the audience for any additional. And, and I don't know much about gaming, right? So I'm just really intrigued with the space and what's going on, momentum, and the potential scope of this phenomenon in the U.S. And doing research in prep for the event, I found a recent LA Times story in which, and I wrote this down because it's too long. The owner of the LA Times, Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, was recently quoted saying, "The most evolved engagement engine is video gaming, Fortnite. The millennials across Twitch interconnect and communicate." He continued on saying, and I paraphrase here, that he recognized video games and esports as being central to the evolution of modern news media. And he qualified that by saying that the Times is expanding its esports coverage in its sports page and wants to leverage this and investment in other digital platforms to shore up the Times position with millennials and sports fans across the nation. So to the panel, and I guess I'll go to you first, Alex, to the point of video games and esports being central to the evolution of modern news media.
Yeah,
agree, disagree? What's your comment on that?
Absolutely. I think whenever I try and talk about esports or spectator gaming, the point I try and drive home to people is that this is a media phenomenon that grows out of a number of threads that are kind of coming together, and so the sort of the maturation of the games industry, but the sort of the move towards the sort of the consumption of more and more media online and through these streaming platforms. But it also anticipates all of these different ways that people will consume and pay for their media. And so esports is particularly fascinating because it's driven not by advertising in a traditional sense. I mean, that's a component of it, but at the same time, it's also this sort of this patron economy or this platform economy where people are investing because they're interested and they're donating to individual players or teams. It's also an attention economy that kind of drives this fan practice back towards the games. And so I think it's beyond the sort of the realm of esports as this sort of this crystallized sort of insular media phenomenon. I think it anticipates the ways that people connect with media and sort of engage with media platforms in the contemporary moment, and it goes way beyond sort of selling products at intervals in sports broadcasts or something. It's all of these ways for people to invest in media in a way that feels more sort of personal and more complete. And so I think that's what makes it kind of this this really kind of ripe engagement that's that has a lot of kind of kinks to be worked out and things to kind of get tested, and there's a lot of room for it to grow. I think it's the demographics are something that I think needs to be considered. That it reaches 80%. This audience is 80% men. And
so going back to the cord cutters and post TV sort of millennial market,
yeah, I think
they're as a publisher, as a traditional news media publisher, you're looking to tap into that social connectivity and the expansion.
I think it's young and socially connected, but I think it also has a lot of growing up to do. Yeah.
Got it. Andrew, Jen?
No.
Well,
too deep, right? I know.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is kind of a big question, but it sort of brought to mind a couple of things. First, when people are, gaming, they're not only on one platform. So, like, a couple of the guys on our team, including Jonathan, are, competing and streaming all the time. And, while they're competing and while they're streaming, we'll be sitting there, you know, chatting them on Twitch and just trashing them, or we'll be in, you know, we'll be in on Discord and just, you know, kind of having a whole little separate conversation there. So you're really talking across, you know, 3 things instead of just one. And it's all of us that are watching. Like, we're not even playing. We're just, you know, making fun of something he said. And then another thing that is, I guess it's not directly esports, but I don't know if you were paying attention to the Google Stream stuff or the Microsoft xCloud. So they're sort of doing, let's say, a Netflix model for games. So like on Google Stream, the test was with a game called Assassin's Creed that normally you need a console to play. So you can just stream and, you know, play this through through Google. And, you know, Microsoft is, they said they're launching xCloud sometime next year, but that's going to be, I honestly think that those 2 announcements will turn out to be the most important announcements of the year. But, you know, so now think if everybody's, you know, getting this media through, you know, through a Netflix model. Like, think how powerful, you know, Netflix has become with, you know, with what they're doing, and, you know, Amazon, you know, trying to catch up. So those were the couple things that I thought of.
Yeah, interesting. So stay tuned as we see this evolve. I have more questions, but don't want to shortchange the audience. I think if we need mics, we might have some floating around. The Angel jersey? All right.
We could hear you. Well, that was actually when we were talking to a lot of competitors, you know, because we talked to pros, we talked to, you know, college team players, we talked to just weekend players, and toxicity was a thing that came up all the time, which was why we also decided to make a foray into matchmaking. And one of the things that that we're sort of designing the machine learning around is this idea of kind of what your personality is like, because I don't know that you're going to eliminate all the toxicity. If those people can all go find each other and, you know, play together, like, and because that might be your thing, and if that's not what you want, you know, you can avoid it. And then I also have kind of a different, because, you know, I don't like it either, but I have kind of a different perspective on it. And it was when I was kind of early on in the game industry, I knew a game developer whose son had MS, and video games were a huge outlet for him. And he was a player killer. He would just go in and just grief everybody and blast the crap out of them, and was just a total dick. But it was a huge, you know, it was a huge outlet for them. So I think if you can kind of you know, if you can sort of connect the people that want that, let the people that don't want that, you know, avoid it. You know, I don't know how you completely get rid of it. I mean, I know that's a huge challenge that all of the, you know, all of the platforms are going for, but, you know, that it doesn't necessarily, you know, spread into real life. Sometimes it's just a, you know, an outlet for people, and maybe that's a better outlet for them to express that than, you know, at school in, you know, in real life. Yeah.
I think there's this, you know, sort of the nature of games that they you know, kind of create this space apart, or this like place where you can kind of do these, you know, imaginary things. And the way that they've been marketed, you know, is kind of about the sort of the agency of the player and about this kind of complete expression of yourself. And I think that's, you know, that's kind of what the sort of the culture of esports or video game celebrities is, you know, is about at a certain level. Not toxicity, but about the sort of these video games as a way to sort of bring something out of yourself. And I think that that's something that platforms are kind of struggling with. I mean, you see the sort of the policing of like PewDiePie and his kind of performance as a sort of, you know, as this brand ambassador for YouTube. You know, it then kind of gets reined in, and I think it's going to be this sort of this back and forth between a kind of a very sort of do anything, be anyone, you know, it's a game, and, you know, video games kind of having to sort of situate themselves in the broader, you know, media space.
And I think as more money comes into it, it will also moderate, because, you know, you see professional athletes and most of those teams expect a certain code of conduct. You know, they don't want videos of people, you know, beating their wife on the elevator. Like, that's, you know, and those players get fined for it. They lose their careers. I mean, as these people want to rise through the professional ranks, you know, you'll see these organizations have a code of conduct for, you know, for these young men and women. And also, you know, they'll lose their sponsors, or, you know, their teams will lose their sponsors. So, you know, I think that, I think as it becomes more, you know, more of a public kind of mass phenomenon, you know, you'll see it change.
Hey guys, my name is Sergey. First of all, I want to thank you for this event being put on by MIT. It's awesome as always. Been coming on and off since 2000, so I've been here for like 18 years, I guess. James touched a good point. My question is about something else, but I'm actually a Dota player myself, Go Dota, right? But it was like number 5 on Andrew's list, but it's actually biggest prize pool this year. It's like $25 million. FYI, the company that is running this keeps 3/4 of the money, so they made something like 75+ million, and the price is actually more like 100 million. So they kept 75 and they gave out like 25 million as the prize money. But we're not talking about the money, we're talking about the next step. And then the question I have, which kind of Andrew started touching upon, and you guys all touched upon, is esports and eLeagues is, you know, competitive like we have in the physical world. We have these NBA stars, Michael Jordan, whatnot, right? But majority of people who are watching this and also playing, first of all, for moderation, it's up to the companies to moderate that, because they're nobody, they're just, you know, hopping on and trashing and doing that. But what I'm thinking about, and the question is more in direction of the next layer of money making, right? And it's the celebrities. It's people who are maybe not competing, and maybe they're not even that good at it, but they're YouTubers, they're streamers on Twitch. They're people who are personalities. And I wanted to maybe get more of an opinion from each one of you guys on those celebrities. So we're not competitive level, which takes 18 hours a day of practice since you're born until you're 16 when you're still clicking fast. But the guys who are actually commenting, they're out there making fun comments, making it fun for people to be the commentators and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of very successful video bloggers, I think they're generally called, on YouTube and Twitch and so on, and that make a healthy amount of money. I mean, since Twitch and YouTube, their business model is to give back based upon the number of subscribers you have. There are some that have, you know, had that breakout success that aren't necessarily great at the games that they're playing, but like you said, are interesting personalities and provide some sort of interesting commentary that enough people watch that, that they get feedback on. Yeah.
In Asia, a lot of the shoutcasters make more than the players. And the first gaming conference I went to in Asia years ago, there were huge lines for autographs. And the lines for the shoutcasters were bigger than the lines for the top players. So, and there's a lot more popular streaming platforms in Asia. The top ones are all competing to sign, shoutcasters and the top streamers for like exclusives to only stream on their platform. And as you start to see, more streaming platforms come up here, you'll see that. So one of the guys on our team is he's an Xbox streamer, and Facebook actually just signed him to exclusively stream on Facebook instead of Twitch. So you'll start to see that.
I think I mean the idea of this sort of celebrity gamer is part of like this bigger sort of micro celebrity movement, and so there's I think it gets to this broader point as well, is that there's a lot of uncertainty, but a lot of sort of money floating around, and there's this sort of diversity of pipelines that sort of get it into there. So you have advertisers, but you also have these sort of patron economies where users are donating to people that they like, or or paying to have their message read out over a stream or something like that. And so, so I think that there's this kind of trend in that direction, and it has to do with the sort of the segmenting of media. And so, instead of having 50 cable channels to choose from 10 years ago, you now have a couple 100,000 Twitch streamers or YouTubers to select from, and you form these deep relationships with them. And so that's really what's driving the Twitch model, is these deep user relationships with individual media producers who, for some of whom the toxicity is a boon. So it's this sort of segmenting and siloing and radical diversification of the marketplace that these people are participating in.
So I want to dive in for 1 sec. So a successful streamer on Twitch, how many viewers, on average or at any given time, is considered successful?
It really depends. I was doing these participant interviews for the research that I do, and was talking to this guy who was reaching consistently 3,000 people would be watching him. And he was making $500,000 a year just from their donations and subscriptions and gift money and stuff. So that's for an individual, that's a significant amount of money, especially kind of being just a video game kind of nerd. That's his background. He was like, I worked at Starbucks.
Some people might take exception to that.
No, I
either bask in it, right?
Yeah. That's me, but yeah. I didn't think to, start a Twitch channel, So yeah, it's this, it's a very small market for some of these people, but it's about these deep connections.
So you guys talked a lot about esports on a global scale, but as far as local scenes go, because everything kind of starts from that grassroots. When I think of Santa Barbara and the Central Coast in general, I think of kind of like a crossroads between NorCal, SoCal, Central California. So I was wondering, as a person who runs an esports organization in Santa Barbara that is mildly successful, I'd like to hear what your guys' thoughts are on kind of local scenes, how to build that grassroots, how to go out and get yourself into that global market that we were talking about.
There's a lot of interest from game developers, in growing local and grassroots esports events or competitions. And you talked about these smaller Madden competitions. I think that's the kind of the appeal of a lot of this, is that it's user generated or participatory media, and so there's a lot of ways in, but you know, what's the organization?
Sorry, it's Gold Coast Esports.
Oh, cool.
That's awesome.
Primarily Santa Barbara based, but we do events from Ventura all the way to Slow, Paso, Extended. We play mostly Super Smash Bros. And so it's all LAN based. We get like 50 plus people in a room, and everyone just starts going at it until there's 2 people left. So, as far as trying to expand that market goes, I guess is the context.
Yeah.
We've seen different groups do things like everything from inviting more like prominent players as a draw, or they might host different like regional teams. So if you're like a Central Coast organization, maybe get connected with an organization someplace else in the country, and then kind of host them here. And there are a lot of sponsors that are interested in kind of the, smaller, smaller community events. Like HP Omen, I know, sponsors a lot of you'll see them sponsor a lot of the smaller events because, Intel's kind of taken over, all of the big events. But when we've seen, other organizations do this, it's they're sort of connecting with, other groups around the country, either for hosting them in person or hosting it online. And the other cool thing that we're kind of seeing across the country is organizations are starting to want to develop their local teams. So, people will kind of have you've got all of your, pro sports organizations are city-based, right? So you can kind of get your Central Coast and your local loyalty, and then start kind of having a rivalry with, a different part of the country. And I think we're going to see that more and more.
I think Nintendo's famously ambivalent about their esports scene, which is the difficulty with Smash Brothers.
Which is funny because they recently created a Twitter account that is just all about promoting the esports side.
Your hope is the new Smash game is maybe they'll get behind that. But you have a narrow. I mean, that's the demographic question. I think is is your strength and also the room for growth around esports. Is that's an appealing market to the right organization.
Yeah, I would think in general, I mean, they're dealing with a retail business, so I would think typical retail marketing strategies would apply to get customers in the door. Thinking off the top of my head, it's possible that you could establish relationships with some developers to see if it's possible that they might be interested in doing some special events, especially with beta versions that are coming out. If maybe you would have a closed beta environment and be able to record data and give them sort of feedback on it, almost like a quasi QA sort of thing. Most of the developers are big pain in the asses and won't do that because they'll be so worried about security. But I just off the top of my head, that might be something that might be interesting to
yeah, we'd love to have you in our beta.
I can help you get relationships with developers too, if you just want the right person to talk to about it.
Thank you guys, appreciate it.
There you go. All right, we have time for one more. Go right here, Joe, my good friend. Yeah, no, we'll go to Joe right here. Thanks, Dave. And so, folks, I think the panel is going to stick around for a few minutes after the program, too.
First of all, thank you guys for coming. Andrew, one of your slides was the LAN party. And, I was in high school doing LAN parties. So, gaming has been a big part of my life on and off and so on. And one of the things through all of the years of gaming that's been kind of a byproduct, but I think is absolutely probably one of the most important pieces to all of this puzzle, is the friendships that you make. And, through kind of the analogy for anyone that isn't a gamer, if you think about, go back to, your high school, whether you're in football and cheer or one of those other things, that those 4 years of doing those team sports develop lifelong relationships. And, some of my best friends, I met through World of Warcraft, and we've stayed in touch and throughout the years. And kind of piggybacking on a couple of these other thoughts, what I'm really curious about is when you go into Korea and China and these areas where the esports has gotten a lot more popular, the U.S. is catching up, how how much traction, what part of the fan culture or the base are like junior high school teams, high school teams, and so on, and how much has that contributed to the popularity in those countries, and where is the U.S. and some of the more kind of Western countries, where are they in relationship to that?
In Asia, it can depend a little bit on the country. So, for example, in China, people aren't playing as heavily in high school because it's so competitive for them to sort of get into the next level of school that they're really spending all of their time studying. So you're seeing it younger, but what you're seeing the platforms curtail because it's all regulated by the government. So past it, they're requiring the games to say, you know, if you're 12 or under, you can only play this, you know, like an hour a day. If you're 12 to 18, you can play this many hours. So you're seeing most of the age group there, you know, college and post-college. And in the other countries, it's a lot more evenly distributed. But it's kind of everybody, you know, there really, because if they're not, you know, if they're not playing it, and they might be kind of the way it is here. You might be a weekend basketball player. Or you might play at a men's league. You might play on a farm team. You might play in the NBA. You know, it's all organized. It's kind of the same thing there. For every level, there's an organization. There's a way to step up and move in. So it's really variable by country. They skew a little older in China.
My favorite anecdote from I was in Korea for a month doing research. And I went to this internet cafe, and you'd see these like groups of 5 kids that would come in. They'd be like a 5-man League of Legends team, and they would like come in and sit down at the computers as a group, and like all be talking to each other. And so I think that's like that element is there kind of universally, and that's, I mean, the reason I've played it so long is I've friends that have gone off in different directions, and we still get together and play. And so I think that's that personal element is enabled by the kind of these platforms for for connecting people, and I think that's a big draw for the sort of the whole esports things is it's like creating these personalities. So you have a relationship with your friends, but you also then sort of know these esports celebrities like Fatality or I don't know, Sneaky if you're a League of Legends fan or something. Or it's I think that element's still there.
So to add one point to that, I mean, I recently read that there are 17 intercollegiate programs and some offering scholarships. So, and as you pointed out in your presentation, high schools are kind of, I don't know that there's a quantifiable number out there yet, but to your point, Joe, I mean, it is becoming cultural and embedded in our academics and whatnot. So that closes it out. One, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. We're always pleased to see the community participating in our events.